How did we get stuck with this guy in the White House in the first place? I think we're all intimately aware of all the entertainment that went on in the state of Florida. To me, it was a typical Florida election, only this time they got caught. Wouldn't surprise me if the old Jewish lady ballots got thrown into the canal in every election. Gore didn't help his own cause very much either, did he? Bitching and moaning and groaning about what was going on in South Florida, but for some reason couldn't be bothered to make a bigger stink about the bigger scandal in northern Florida, where the cops were blocking off streets in selected neighborhoods and asking people for 5 pieces of ID if they made it past the roadblock for the crime of attempting to vote while black. And if somebody did manage to come up with 5 pieces of ID and only black people got asked this, then they had to check the convicted felons list. Sorry, boy, you're on the list as a convicted felon. It's best you go on home where you belong. But wait a minute. I'm a minister. That's my church right over there. I've never been arrested in my life. You're on the list, boy. It's best you go back to your place if you know what's good for you. Found out a lot of interesting things in Florida. When I went to Tallahassee in Florida, at Florida State University, literally across the tracks is the so-called black school, Florida A&M, mostly African-American students, 8,000 to 10,000 of them there, and those who lived on campus, meaning most of them, they were supposed to vote in the student union. Come Election Day 2000, the student union was locked up with nothing posted as to where people could go to vote. Why didn't Gore protest that? Was he allergic to being photographed with civil rights leaders or something? I don't know. There's a book out now on the Florida elections called The Best Democracy Money Can Buy by Greg Palast, who also writes for the British Guardian. He and his people got hold of some documents none of the American media bothered to read that showed that Katherine Harris, the Secretary of State for Florida, who was in charge of the election, who was also King George II's campaign manager for the state of Florida, hired a private firm months before the election to figure out a way to purge the voter rolls of so-called convicted felons, meaning mostly African Americans. But it turned out when Palast looked at some of these records, it showed people weren't allowed to vote because they were convicted of felonies in 2004 and 2007. Check that out. This is what democracy really looks like.
The Tallahassee Lassie and the bleaching of the voter rolls. If we were going to show the Republicans' black voter caging lists on BBC television, we'd better make sure that they were not planted with false material. So we went to the horse's mouth. 2 weeks before the election, our BBC crew flew to Washington to ask about the lists, but the Republican National Committee slammed the door on us. Back in Florida, we thought we'd ask Brett Doster, Supreme Commander of the Bush campaign in that state, straight up, Brett, did you lose something? Is this your list? Do you and the RNC intend to block a few 100,000 black folk from voting on November 2nd? In Tallahassee, the path to Doster's door was blocked by a thick-armed blonde slurping on a supersized Coca-Cola, Mindy Tucker Fletcher, chief spokesmistress for the Bush campaign in Florida. Brett, she said, couldn't speak for himself. He'd canceled our appointment. She would do the talking on his behalf. She smiled at me. It was not a ray of sunshine. Mindy Tucker Fletcher is one of those public relations flags with that condescending, faux-friendly manner, who is always so glad to meet you, but would prefer if you would suddenly die in pain. After a little Q&A dance, I finally asked Mindy, played here by Janine Garofalo, if the Republican Party kept something called a caging list of voters.
I don't know what a caging list is. I don't. I'm not part of that strategy.
That strategy? I showed her the list. I can't say she started snorting cola out of her nose, but clearly she was flustered. She took the list inside the brick citadel, the George Herbert Walker Bush Republican Center, while I maintained a low-speed chase with her assistant, lobbing questions as he ducked into a stairwell. Half an hour later, Mindy, painted with fresh makeup, a retinue of jumpy PR men in tow, asked to speak to our cameras. Suddenly, she was an expert on caging lists. She began,
Clearly, you don't know a lot about politics if you don't know this term, caging.
With the list in her hand, she could not deny its authenticity. But there was an explanation. There always is an explanation. Joseph Agostini, the Republicans' director of communications, nervously sputtered that the lists were made up of potential donors to the Bush-Cheney campaign. Really? On one list we gave them were several residents of the Sulzbacher Center, a shelter for the homeless. Do you get a lot of major donors from poor African-American neighborhoods? Mindy cut Agostini off with a shut-it-fool glare and stepped in with a different line altogether.
These are newly registered voters we mailed to, where the letter came back, bad addresses.
No kidding. No one sends campaign junk mail first class. It's too expensive unless you had a reason to pay for a very expensive set of return addresses. Mr. Agostini, you wouldn't be preparing to challenge the vote of these black folk, would you? Agostini started jabbering. Mindy shut him down with another shut-your-gap look. It was time for the boss lady to take over.
This is not a challenge list,
Mindy said.
That's not what it's set up to be.
So you won't use these lists to challenge voters on Election Day?
That's not what they were created to do.
3 points for Mindy. Well-crafted words. Using the list might be legal, but creating the list to bleach the voter rolls white is not. Will you challenge voters on Election Day? Mindy.
Where it's stated in the law? Yeah.
She saw my eyes widen, so she added,
Everyone does it, both parties, all the time. You can check.
We did. Everyone does not do it. Certainly not in Florida. Our investigators called a dozen county elections offices. Not one of them could recall a single Election Day challenge in their career. More confidential Republican caging lists poured in. Hit lists of African-American voters, including students of Edward Waters College, an African-American school, and the Jacksonville State Street Rescue Mission. Voters in black precincts made the list if a first-class letter sent to them was returned. They could then be challenged based on an address change. We checked one list, which included 50 black soldiers. We called one Randall Prouser. His wife indicated that his dress had been changed because he was shipped overseas. Go to Baghdad, lose your vote. Nice. A black soldier's vote gone. Mission accomplished. On October 26, 2004, a week before the election, we broke the story on BBC Television's Newsnight. According to the network, it was the most watched story around the globe that week, but not in the USA. Only one single U.S. TV network mentioned what looked like a massive attack planned against black voters. ABC Television's website informed its patrons that, quote, the entire BBC story was more or less entirely incorrect. Really? ABC's source, Mindy Tucker Fletcher. For the USA, it was a story over and buried. On November 2nd, they did as we feared. The Republican Party launched a massive multi-million-dollar campaign of mass challenges of voters in black precincts, concentrating on Ohio, where the GOP worked from a list of 35,000 names. Ohio's Secretary of State, Kenneth Blackwell, claimed, with some justification, that the Ohio Republican Party didn't break the law. Court orders only barred racially targeted challenges by the Republican National Committee. In Florida, prudently, Republican operators did not carry the list, because Democratic lawyers who saw our broadcast said they would file suit. But the Republicans challenged thousands, nonetheless, in Florida, as well as in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The United States hadn't seen such a mass challenge of dark-skinned voters since Martin Luther King was jailed in Birmingham. The caging memo distribution list makes clear the Republican National Committee was into it up to their necks, notwithstanding a 1981 no race-baiting consent decree and the Voting Rights Act. Protecting these caged voters was the job of Attorney General John Ashcroft. But Ashcroft did nothing. I should note that before Mindy became flag catcher for the Bush campaign, she was press spokesperson for Attorney General John Ashcroft. In fairness, I acknowledge that Republican lists did not target black people only. In Palm Beach, they hit retirement areas for elderly Jews.